Nobody is coming, not your best friend, not your mentor, not the person who told you they believed in you. Nobody is coming to pull you out of this. And the sooner you stop waiting, the sooner your life actually begins. Here's what I've noticed about the people who actually make it. The ones who build something real, something that lasts. They didn't have a bigger support system than you. They didn't have better circumstances, a warmer family, or a smoother start. What they had was something you can't borrow from anyone else. They learned how to keep going when the room was empty and silent. They learned the psychology of winning alone. And here's the thing that most people never figure out. That silence, that aloneness that feels like your biggest weakness right now, it might be the most powerful training ground you'll ever step into, but only if you know what to do with it. Let's talk about that. Chapter 1. Stop waiting for someone to hand you the key. Let me ask you something honest. How long have you been waiting? Maybe you've been waiting for the right mentor to show up and recognize your potential. Maybe you've been waiting for someone close to you to finally say, "I believe in you. Go for it." Maybe you've been waiting for conditions to be a little more stable, for the timing to be a little more right, for someone to give you permission to move. If any of that hit close to home, I want you to sit with this. The waiting itself is the problem, not the circumstances, not the people around you, the waiting. Here's a truth that nobody posts on their vision board, but everyone needs to hear. Your success is not going to arrive on someone else's schedule. Your happiness is not going to be handed to you because you've been patient enough. Your growth, your future, your life, it's already in your hands. It has been this whole time. The moment you actually feel that, not just intellectually understand it, but feel it in your bones, everything shifts. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy looking outward. They scan their environment for signals, for someone to validate their ambitions, for a mentor who gets it, for a friend who truly pushes them. And while they're scanning, time moves. Quietly and without apology, time just moves. A year becomes 2. 2 becomes 5. And the potential that was sitting right there, fully intact, starts to gather dust under the weight of waiting. The psychology of winning alone doesn't start with tactics or routines. It starts with one radical decision. I am responsible for everything that happens from here. Not just the wins, all of it. The missed shots, the detours, the days you didn't show up the way you wanted to. When you take ownership of the full picture, something remarkable happens inside you. The blame dissolves, and in its place, you find something far more useful: power. This isn't about becoming cold or closed off. You can still learn from people. You can still appreciate support when it finds you. But you stop needing it the way a plant needs water. You build the roots deep enough that whether someone waters you or not, you're still growing. Think about the people in your life who you genuinely respect, the ones who seem to carry themselves differently, who don't seem rattled by opinion or shaken by setbacks. What's the common thread? They're not waiting. They're not performing for an audience. They've built something inside that doesn't depend on outside conditions to function. That's what you're building right now, with every decision you make that comes from your values instead of someone else's approval. Here's where you begin. Start noticing when you reach for external permission. When you're about to ask someone what they think about a choice that only you can truly evaluate, pause. Ask yourself first, What do I actually think? What does my gut say? You don't have to cut advice out of your life, but start developing the habit of consulting yourself first. Make that the default. Make external input the supplement, not the foundation. Build the small habits that support your independence, a morning that belongs to you, before the noise of the day, before anyone else's agenda, an evening that lets you process what happened without needing to debrief with someone just to feel okay. Moments of quiet decision where you choose, you act, and you trust that choice enough to stand behind it. The shift feels uncomfortable at first. It's supposed to. You're rewiring something deep. But here's what's on the other side of that discomfort. A version of you that can't be destabilized by someone leaving, by encouragement drying up, or by the world not cooperating with your timeline. You stop being someone who collapses when the applause stops. You become someone who performs the same whether there's a crowd or an empty room. That person was always in there. You've just been outsourcing their power. Chapter 2. Build your own measuring stick. Here's something that will quietly drain your entire life if you let it. Measuring yourself by what other people notice. Likes, recognition, the nod from someone you respect, the comment that tells you you're on track. These things feel meaningful in the moment, but if your sense of whether you're doing well depends on whether anyone is watching or clapping, you've handed control of your inner life to people who don't know your full story, don't share your values, and aren't going to be around for all of it. Winners, real ones, the kind who build something that lasts, they play by a different measurement system. They've built what I call an internal scorecard, and it's not posted anywhere. No one else can see it. But they check it every single day. Your internal scorecard measures things that actually predict who you're becoming. Did I bring my real effort today, or a performance of effort? Did I make a decision that I can respect when I look back on it? Did I push through the moment when it would have been easier to stop? Did I treat someone with more respect than they may have earned? These aren't metrics the world rewards with trophies, but they're the ones that build the kind of character that makes external achievement actually meaningful when it comes. Without this inner scorecard, you can win big on the outside and still feel hollow on the inside because you've been measuring yourself with someone else's ruler. Here's the trap with external scorecards. They're controlled by variables you'll never fully manage. Someone else decides whether your work gets noticed. Someone else determines whether your effort is appreciated. Someone else chooses whether today is the day they give you a kind word. You can do everything right and still get nothing on that external scale, not because you fell short, but because the person holding the measuring tape is dealing with their own stuff and simply isn't paying attention. Building your own scorecard starts with getting honest about what you actually value, not what sounds good in a conversation, not what you think you should care about. What genuinely moves you at a core level? What would you feel quietly proud of if no one ever found out? That's your real value system, and those values become the foundation of your personal measurement system. One of the most freeing parts of this shift is what it does to your relationship with results. External scorecards are obsessed with outcomes. Did you win? Did you get picked? Did it work? But outcomes are only partly in your control. Internal scorecards focus on process, on the quality of your effort, the consistency of your standards, the honesty of your intentions. You can measure process every single day, regardless of what the outcome turns out to be. This is not an excuse to ignore results. Results matter, but they're information, not identity. You use them to course correct, not to decide whether you have worth. Here's a practice that changes things quickly. At the end of each day, before you check your phone or collapse into sleep, ask yourself 3 questions. Where did I show up fully today? Where did I fall short of my own standard? What's one thing I'll do differently tomorrow? That's it. 3 questions. Your own private audit. No audience needed. Over time, this daily habit builds what psychologists call an internal locus of control. The felt sense that you are the primary driver of what happens in your life, not a passenger being moved around by external forces. It makes you more decisive because you stop waiting for permission. It makes you more resilient because your sense of self doesn't hinge on how today's results landed. And here's something nobody talks about enough. The private victories. The day you chose to do the hard thing even though no one was looking. The moment you kept your integrity when compromising would have been easy. The time you stayed consistent when everything in you wanted to coast. These moments will never show up in any public metric, but they are the actual building blocks of your character. And character is what shows up when the conditions get hard. You want a life that doesn't bend every time the wind changes? Start measuring yourself differently. Carry your own ruler. Know what a good day means to you. And let that be enough. Chapter 3. Light your own fire. Let's be real with each other for a moment. You've had days, maybe stretches of days, where you waited to feel motivated before doing anything, where you told yourself, once I feel ready, once the energy shows up, once someone or something sparks me, then I'll move. And in that waiting, the day ended. And then another one. And the gap between who you are and who you want to be quietly widened. Here's the truth that separates people who build things from people who plan to build things. Motivation is not a prerequisite for action. It's often a result of it. The people who have mastered self-motivation don't have a secret reservoir of energy the rest of us lack. They've just understood something the rest of us keep forgetting. You don't wait for the fire to start moving. You move, and the fire starts. Think about the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. A thermometer reads the room. It tells you what the temperature is, but it just reflects what's already there. A thermostat sets the temperature. It decides what the environment should be and makes it happen regardless of what it started as. People who win alone have become thermostats. They don't read the emotional weather of their day and decide based on that whether to show up. They decide to show up, and they create the weather. This starts with the most unsexy habit in personal development. Doing it anyway, not when you feel like it. Not when the conditions cooperate. Not when someone has pumped you up enough. Just doing it anyway with whatever energy is available, because you made a commitment to yourself that doesn't have an exception clause for low motivation mornings. But self-motivation isn't just discipline for its own sake. There's a deeper fuel source that makes this sustainable. It's called purpose connection, knowing not just what you're doing, but why it genuinely matters to you. Not in a vague self-help poster kind of way, in a specific, visceral, personal kind of way. Ask yourself, what would be true about your life in 5 years if you kept showing up consistently, even on the hard days? What would that feel like? What would it mean for the people around you? What would it mean for the version of you that's been quietly hoping you'd finally follow through? Get specific. Get emotional about it. That specificity is fuel. Self-motivated people have also figured out how to create their own feedback loops. Instead of waiting for someone else to tell them they're making progress, they track it themselves. They keep a private log. They notice their own improvements. They celebrate the milestones that no one else even knows exist. The internal feedback doesn't wait for external confirmation. It runs on its own track. There's another piece here that's crucial: your relationship with future you. Self-motivation requires the ability to clearly see the person you're becoming, not as an abstract idea, but as someone you feel genuine loyalty to. You're not just grinding through a hard morning for some distant goal. You're showing up for a specific person, the one you're in the process of becoming, who is counting on the choices you make today. And when things get hard, which they will, the self-motivated person has a tool that others don't: reframing. When an obstacle appears, the dependent person asks, "Why is this happening to me?" The self-motivated person asks, "What is this building in me?" That question doesn't make the obstacle smaller, but it makes you bigger in relation to it, and that changes everything about how you move through it. Finally, build rituals that generate energy rather than drain it. A morning that starts on your terms. A physical practice that reminds your body what it's capable of. An evening that closes the day with intention. These aren't luxuries. They're the mechanical structure that keeps the fire burning when the feeling fades. Feelings are seasonal. Rituals are reliable. You don't need someone to believe in you to move forward. You need you to believe in you, and then you need to act like it. That's what lighting your own fire means. And once you learn to do it, no one can ever take that away from you. Chapter 4. Own your emotional weather. Here's something most people never admit out loud, even to themselves. Their entire inner world is being run by other people. Not dramatically, not obviously, but quietly, consistently. The mood of the person sitting across from them at breakfast sets the tone for their morning. A short reply to a text message sends them into a spiral of overthinking. One careless comment from someone they barely know can sit in their chest for 3 days. And without realizing it, they've outsourced the management of their emotional life to the people around them. That's not connection. That's dependence. And it's one of the most exhausting ways to live. Emotional independence doesn't mean you stop feeling things. It doesn't mean you build a wall and call it strength. It means you become the one who decides what you do with what you feel, rather than being pulled around by it like a boat without an anchor in open water. Let me be clear about what this looks like in real life. Emotional independence is the person who receives hard news and doesn't immediately reach for the phone to have someone else process it for them. It's the person who faces criticism and doesn't need instant reassurance to recover their footing. It's the person who can sit in a difficult emotion, uncertainty, frustration, sadness, without immediately running from it or demanding that someone else fix it. And here's the part that trips most people up. It doesn't mean those feelings aren't there. It means you're no longer afraid of them. The foundation of emotional independence is self-awareness, genuinely knowing your own patterns. What situations consistently knock you sideways? What kinds of people or comments have the most power to destabilize you. What does your default reaction look like when you're stressed, criticized, or disappointed? Most people can't answer these questions clearly because they've never stopped to look. They just react, and then they react to their reaction, and then they're exhausted by Tuesday. When you start mapping your emotional landscape, not to judge it, but just to understand it, you take the first step toward actually managing it. You move from being someone who gets hijacked by emotions to someone who notices them, names them, and chooses a response. Self-soothing is a skill that very few adults have consciously developed. We live in a culture that has a quick fix for every uncomfortable feeling. Scroll, snack, call someone, watch something, buy something, anything to not just sit there with the feeling, but the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately running from it or flooding someone else with it. That's one of the most important things you'll ever build. This might mean learning to breathe through something instead of reacting to it. It might mean journaling when you're overwhelmed instead of texting 5 people. It might mean going for a walk and letting your body process what your mind is trying to sort out. It might simply mean sitting quietly for 5 minutes and letting the wave pass without trying to stop it or amplify it. None of these are glamorous, but all of them make you more capable, more stable, and more free. There's another piece of emotional independence that people rarely talk about honestly: learning to separate your worth from how others treat you. This is harder than it sounds. When someone is dismissive or unkind or simply doesn't show up for you the way you needed, the instinct is to make it about you, to wonder what you did wrong, what's wrong with you, why you're always the one left holding the emotional weight. But here's the reframe that changes things. How people treat you is a projection of their own internal world far more than it is a verdict on yours. Their impatience might be about their stress. Their criticism might be about their own fear of inadequacy. Their absence might be about their own avoidance patterns. This doesn't mean their behavior is acceptable. Sometimes it isn't. But it does mean it isn't the final word on your value. When you truly internalize this, something loosens. The emotional charge around other people's behavior softens. You stop waiting for them to be different so you can feel okay. You feel okay, and you address what needs addressing from that grounded place. Emotional independence also means learning to validate yourself. This sounds simple, but it goes against a deeply ingrained habit for most people. We've been trained since childhood to look outward for the signal that we're okay. The grade, the approval, the gold star, the nod from someone we respect. Learning to generate that signal internally is like learning to use a muscle you didn't know was atrophied. Start small. After a difficult conversation, instead of immediately asking someone else how you handled it, ask yourself. After completing something hard, instead of waiting for recognition, let yourself feel the satisfaction privately. After making a tough decision, instead of seeking reassurance, stand behind your own reasoning. These small acts of self-validation compound. They build an inner voice that isn't waiting for permission to feel good about who you are and what you're doing. The goal isn't to become an island. The goal is to become a continent, stable enough to support real relationships, rather than being constantly eroded by the need for them to prop you up. When you're emotionally self-sufficient, you can love people without needing them to complete you. You can be present with others without silently demanding something from them. You can give genuinely, freely, because you're not already running on empty, waiting for someone to fill you back up first. Own your emotional weather, because the person who controls their inner climate controls their life. Chapter 5. Stop asking the room for directions. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly seeking input on your own life, and most people don't even recognize it's happening. You make a decision, and then you immediately call 3 people to see what they think. You have an idea, and you share it in a group chat before you've even sat with it yourself. You feel something, and you need to run it past someone else before you trust that what you're feeling is real. And somewhere in all of that, your own voice gets quieter and quieter because you've been outsourcing the job of thinking for yourself. Trusting your own judgment is not a personality trait you either have or you don't. It's a skill. And like any skill, it atrophies when you don't use it and grows when you do. The reason most people struggle to trust themselves isn't that their judgment is bad. It's that they've never really given it a proper workout. Every time you defer to someone else on a decision you could have made yourself, you send yourself a message. I'm not capable of this alone. Enough of those messages, and you start to believe them, not because they're true, but because repetition creates conviction. And here's the painful part. This pattern often starts with good intentions. You're being humble. You're being collaborative. You're being open-minded. All of those things have genuine value, but there's a version of them that becomes a way of avoiding the vulnerability of actually committing to your own perspective and standing behind it. Because here's what trusting your judgment really requires. You have to be willing to be wrong in your own name, not in someone else's, yours. When you make a call based on other people's input and it doesn't work out, there's a cushion. You followed the advice. You did what someone else suggested. The responsibility is diffused. But when you make a call based on your own thinking and it doesn't work out, you have to own that fully. And for people who haven't built strong self-trust, that prospect is terrifying enough to keep them permanently in the approval loop. But here's what they're trading away. Every time a decision works out based on your own judgment, you build something irreplaceable. You build evidence. Evidence that you can read situations, that your instincts have value, that your thinking is reliable enough to act on. That evidence accumulates into something that no amount of external validation can manufacture. Genuine confidence in your own mind. So how do you actually build this? Start where it's low stakes. Stop asking people what you should wear. Stop polling your social media for restaurant recommendations for yourself. Stop calling a friend every time you need to decide how to spend your weekend. These seem like small things, and they are, but they're the training ground. Make these choices yourself. Live with them. Notice how they turn out. You'll quickly discover that your judgment on everyday things is far more reliable than your anxiety about it not suggests. Then move into slightly bigger territory. A work decision you've been sitting on, a conversation you've been avoiding because you weren't sure how to handle it, a direction you've been considering but haven't committed to because you kept waiting for enough external consensus to feel safe. Make the call. Own it. See what happens. There's something important to understand about self-knowledge here. Most people struggle with decisions not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack clarity about what they actually want and why. When your values are fuzzy, every decision becomes a negotiation between competing external expectations. But when your values are clear, when you know what matters to you, what you're building toward, what you're not willing to compromise, decisions simplify dramatically. You're not choosing between options anymore. You're filtering options through a known framework. One distinction that quietly changes everything. Learn the difference between seeking advice and seeking approval. They feel similar, but they're functionally opposite. Seeking advice means you're gathering information to help you think through a decision more clearly, and you remain the one who decides. Seeking approval means the decision is already essentially made in your gut, and you're looking for someone to ratify it so you don't have to bear the weight of it alone. The first strengthens your judgment. The second slowly dissolves it. When you catch yourself in the approval loop, stop. Ask yourself, do I actually not know what I want here, or do I just not want to be the only one responsible for wanting it? That question is clarifying, and sometimes a little uncomfortable, which usually means it's exactly the right question. Your judgment also improves through reflection, not just experience. After a decision plays out, whether it went well or not, spend 5 minutes asking yourself what you can learn from how it unfolded. What did you miss? What did you read correctly? What would you weigh differently next time? This active reflection is what turns experience into wisdom rather than just elapsed time. And learn to respect your intuition without being ruled by it. Intuition is your mind's way of drawing on pattern recognition that's faster than conscious reasoning. It's not magic, but it's not nothing either. When something feels off, even though the logic looks fine, that's worth pausing for. When something feels right, even though it's hard to articulate why, that's also worth considering. The skill is distinguishing between intuition, which is accumulated experience speaking quietly, and impulse, which is short-term desire speaking loudly. They can feel similar, but they lead to very different places. The person who has learned to trust their own judgment doesn't become arrogant or closed to input. They become more genuinely open to it because they're engaging with others from curiosity rather than dependency. They can hear a perspective that challenges theirs without being destabilized by it. They can consider feedback without needing to immediately adopt it or reject it. They hold their own view firmly enough to think with it and loosely enough to update it when something better comes along. That's not stubbornness. That's intellectual self-respect. Chapter 6. Break the approval addiction. Let's talk about something you may not have named yet, but have almost certainly felt. The constant low-grade anxiety of not knowing whether the people around you are okay with your choices. The way you modify what you say, what you pursue, even what you want, based on what you think others will think about it. The subtle shrinking that happens when you sense disapproval, even unspoken. The way you can talk yourself out of something you genuinely want in 60 seconds flat if you imagine someone important to you raising an eyebrow at it. That's the approval addiction, and it's one of the most sophisticated traps there is because it disguises itself as something reasonable. Caring what people think, being considerate, staying connected to the people around you, none of those things are bad, but there's a version of them that becomes a cage. The approval addiction works like this. Your sense of whether you're okay is tethered to signals from outside yourself. When people around you seem pleased, you feel safe. When they seem disappointed, critical, or simply indifferent, something in you contracts. And over time, you begin unconsciously shaping your decisions, your ambitions, your very sense of who you are, around the project of maintaining that external approval. You stop living your life and start managing your audience. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. The approval you're seeking is never fully available, even from people who genuinely love you. People's moods shift, their attention moves, their opinions evolve. What earns approval today might not tomorrow. And if your inner stability is built on that shifting sand, you'll spend your entire life anxious, because the foundation is fundamentally unreliable. There's also a deeper problem. Seeking approval and pursuing excellence are, more often than not, in direct conflict with each other. Excellence requires going where others haven't gone, which means making choices others don't understand. It requires taking risks that people invested in your safety will worry about. It requires staying the course when the results aren't yet visible, when people around you are starting to express doubt. If you need consistent approval to keep moving, the first wave of uncertainty will stop you, and you'll spend your life on the runway, never actually taking off. The psychological root of approval seeking is usually the fear of rejection, the deep, often childhood wired belief that if people disapprove of you, you are in danger, not physical danger, but the danger of being cut off from belonging, from love, from acceptance. These are primal needs. So the fear makes sense. The problem is that adult life requires a different strategy than the one that worked when you were 7. As an adult, you can survive disapproval. You can be rejected and continue. You can be misunderstood and remain whole. You can have people in your life who don't get what you're doing and still do it. The version of you that learned to seek approval as a child was doing the best thing available at the time. But you've outgrown that strategy. You just haven't fully updated the operating system. Here's a powerful reality check. The people whose approval you're most anxious about are almost always too busy managing their own lives to spend much time actually thinking about your choices. The judgment you're bracing against, it exists far more vividly in your head than in theirs. And the judgment that does exist, it usually reveals far more about them than it does about you. Someone who criticizes your ambition is often someone who has made peace with their own lack of it, and your refusal to do the same disturbs that peace. Someone who doubts your direction is often someone who doubted their own and backed down. And watching you not back down makes them uncomfortable. The criticism isn't really about you. Use it as information, not as verdict. Breaking the approval addiction starts with identifying whose approval you're actually seeking and asking honestly whether those people are living the kind of life you want to live. If the answer is no, that's crucial data. Taking directions from people who haven't been where you want to go is like asking someone who's never left their hometown to navigate you across a continent. They mean well, but they can't see the map. Then start practicing non-explanation, not rudeness, just the quiet discipline of not justifying every choice to everyone who raises an eyebrow. You can acknowledge someone's perspective without adopting it. You can hear a concern without dismantling your plans around it. You can be respectful and still be unmoved. Learn to share your goals and plans selectively, not because you're secretive, but because not every environment is fertile ground for your seeds. Sharing your deepest ambitions with someone who fundamentally doesn't believe in them doesn't invite understanding. It invites discouragement. Protect your vision not by hiding it, but by being thoughtful about where you plant it. And finally, start giving yourself the approval you've been chasing from others. Look at what you're building. Look at how far you've come. Look at the choices you've made that reflect who you're becoming. Acknowledge that, quietly, privately, genuinely. The approval you're looking for from the outside world is something you can generate from within. And when you do, the outside world's opinion becomes something you can consider without being controlled by it. That's not arrogance. That's freedom. Chapter 7. The Quiet Room, Where Strength is Built. There's a room most people never enter willingly. It has no screen, no notifications, no background noise carefully curated to make the silence feel less heavy. No one to perform for, no one to respond to, no one to fill the space with reassuring conversation. It's just you, and whatever is actually going on inside you, unfiltered and unmanaged. Most people walk past that room their entire lives. They keep themselves busy enough, connected enough, stimulated enough that they never have to go in, and they call that living. But what they're actually doing is running from the one place where real strength gets built. That room is solitude, and learning to not just tolerate it, but genuinely inhabit it. That might be the most underrated skill in the entire field of personal development. Here's the distinction that matters most before we go further. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing, and confusing them will cost you. Loneliness is something that happens to you. It's the ache of feeling disconnected, the sense that you're isolated from warmth and belonging. It's passive. It drains. Solitude, on the other hand, is something you choose. It's the intentional practice of being alone with yourself for the purpose of reflection, clarity, and inner growth. It's active. It builds. One is a wound. The other is a workshop. We live in a culture that is structurally terrified of silence. Every gap in stimulation gets filled with a podcast, a scroll, a notification, a conversation that doesn't really need to happen but happens anyway because the quiet felt uncomfortable. We've built an entire technological ecosystem whose primary function, whether it admits it or not, is to ensure that you never have to sit alone with your own thoughts for longer than about 4 seconds. And the cost of that is enormous, because the thoughts you keep running from, they're not your enemies. They're your unprocessed experiences, your unexamined beliefs, your unexplored ideas, waiting for enough stillness to surface. Every time you fill the silence before they can, you miss them, and you stay a little more unknown to yourself. Solitude is where deep thinking actually happens. When you're in constant interaction, responding, performing, reacting, adjusting, your mind is in reactive mode. It's processing incoming signals. But in solitude, something shifts. Your mind moves into a different gear, generative rather than reactive. Connections form between things you didn't realize were connected. Solutions appear that the noise was drowning out. Insights surface that couldn't compete with the volume of constant external input. This is not mystical. This is neuroscience. Your brain needs downtime from social processing to do some of its most important work. Solitude isn't laziness. It's a different kind of productivity, the kind that produces clarity, creativity, and genuine self-knowledge rather than just more output. Here's what solitude does for your emotional life specifically. When you're alone with a difficult feeling, anxiety, grief, frustration, loneliness itself, and you don't immediately run from it or flood someone else with it, something important happens. You discover that you can hold it, that it doesn't destroy you, that it peaks and softens and eventually changes shape. And in that discovery, you build something that no amount of external support can fully give you, the visceral knowledge that you can survive your own emotional experience. That knowledge is the foundation of emotional resilience, not the idea of it, the felt experience of it. But here's what real solitude requires. You have to actually disconnect. Not physically alone while mentally submerged in other people's content. Not sitting in a quiet room with your phone face up on the table. Genuinely, completely disconnected from external input and turned toward your own interior. This might involve sitting with a journal and writing without knowing what you're going to say. It might involve walking without headphones, letting your mind go where it goes without direction. It might involve meditation, not as a performance of mindfulness, but as the simple, difficult practice of staying present with whatever is actually happening inside you. It might just involve sitting in a chair by a window and doing nothing but being there. Start with 10 minutes. That's enough to feel the initial discomfort, the impulse to reach for something, the restlessness that comes from not being stimulated. Stay with it. Notice it without acting on it. The discomfort itself is the practice. And each time you sit with it rather than escape it, it becomes slightly more familiar, slightly less threatening. Over time, what you discover in that quiet room is extraordinary. You learn what you actually think, separate from what you've absorbed from the people around. You find out what you actually want, distinct from what you've been performing wanting, because it fit a role or an expectation. You hear a voice that was always there but could never compete with the volume of everything else, and you realize it's your own. There's also a practical dimension to this. People who spend regular time in solitude make better decisions, not because they become more isolated, but because they've had the space to actually consult themselves before acting. The clarity that comes from genuine internal reflection is different from the clarity that comes from crowdsourcing your thinking. It's slower, but it's yours, and it holds up better under pressure. And here's something that might feel counterintuitive. When you become genuinely comfortable in your own company, your relationships improve, not because you become more distant, but because you become less needy. You can be present with people because you're not desperately seeking something from them. You can listen because you're not just waiting for your turn to be understood. You can enjoy connection because you're choosing it, not clinging to it because the alternative terrifies you. The quiet room is not a punishment. It's not a place for people who have failed at connection. It's a place for people serious about knowing themselves, and everything worth building in a life starts there. Go in. Stay a while. You might be surprised who you find. Chapter 8. You don't owe anyone a justification. Picture this. You make a decision, a real one, something that matters to you, something you thought through and feel grounded in. And the moment you mention it, someone in your life furrows their brow. Maybe they say something. Maybe they just look at you that way. And before you know it, you're talking, explaining, walking them through your reasoning step by step, defending your timeline, your logic, your right to want what you want. And when it's over, whether they seem satisfied or not, you feel strangely depleted. Not because the conversation was hostile, but because something about it felt off. Like you were on trial for a life decision that wasn't theirs to evaluate. That experience has a name: over-explanation. And it's one of the most quietly corrosive habits that psychological independence requires you to break. The need to explain yourself to everyone who questions your direction comes from the same place as approval seeking, the belief, usually operating just below conscious awareness, that your choices aren't valid until they've been understood and accepted by enough people around you. So every raised eyebrow becomes an invitation to justify. Every skeptical question becomes a trial you feel compelled to win. Every expression of doubt becomes evidence that you owe someone a better explanation. But here's the truth that nobody says plainly enough. You don't owe most people an explanation for your life. Not for your career choices, not for your priorities, not for the direction you're walking in, not for what you want or why you want it. Your life is yours. Their confusion about your choices is theirs to sit with, not yours to resolve on their behalf. Now, this isn't about becoming dismissive or closing yourself off from genuine dialogue. There are people in your life whose questions come from love, from real investment in your well-being, from a genuine desire to understand. Those conversations have value. Those are the people you can open up to, not because you owe them an explanation, but because the conversation might actually serve you both. The distinction is critical. Not everyone who questions your choices deserves a detailed account of your reasoning. Some people ask because they're genuinely curious. Some ask because they're concerned. And some ask because your decision makes them uncomfortable and they want you to talk yourself out of it, without ever quite realizing that's what's happening. Learning to tell the difference is one of the most important social skills you can develop. Here's what over-explanation actually costs you. First, it costs you energy, the kind of focused, directed energy that should be going into actually executing your plans. Every hour spent constructing arguments for why your direction makes sense is an hour not spent walking in that direction. Second, and more insidiously, it costs you clarity. When you explain yourself repeatedly to people who see things differently, their perspective starts to infiltrate yours, not through compelling argument, but through sheer repetition and emotional pressure. You start second-guessing not because new information emerged, but because the social friction wore you down. And third, this is the one people least expect, over-explanation often backfires socially. When you feel compelled to justify your choices at length, you can come across as uncertain or defensive, which paradoxically makes others less confident in your direction, not more. Quiet confidence in your own path is far more compelling than an elaborate defense of it. So what does it look like to stop over-explaining without becoming cold or rude? It looks like acknowledging someone's perspective without adopting it. I understand that's how it looks from where you're standing. Full sentence. You've heard them. You've acknowledged their view. You haven't agreed, and you haven't launched into a counter-argument. That's it. It looks like learning a small set of responses that close loops without opening debates. I've thought it through, and I'm confident in this direction. Not defensive, not apologetic, just settled. It looks like being comfortable with the fact that someone walked away from the conversation still skeptical, and that being perfectly fine. Their skepticism is not an emergency you're required to fix. There's also something deeper here worth sitting with. The compulsion to explain yourself often increases when you're around people who haven't built the kind of life you're trying to build. When you're surrounded by people who have made their peace with smaller versions of their lives, your ambition can feel like an implicit criticism of their choices. They didn't say that, but you can feel it in the dynamic. And the over-explanation is often an unconscious attempt to smooth that over, to reassure them that you're not judging them by wanting more. But that's not a problem you can solve by shrinking yourself or by explaining yourself into someone else's comfort zone. You can be kind, you can be warm, you can remain genuinely connected to people who are on different paths, and still not make your path smaller to fit their expectations. One practical shift: start noticing the difference between sharing and defending. Sharing is when you tell someone about something you're excited about or working toward. And you're not waiting for a particular response, you're just communicating. Defending is when you're monitoring their reaction and preparing to argue for your position the moment you detect resistance. Sharing is generous. Defending is anxious. When you catch yourself shifting from sharing to defending, that's your cue to stop talking and let the conversation breathe. The most grounded people you've ever encountered, the ones who seem to carry a quiet sureness about their direction, they're not better at explaining themselves than everyone else. They've simply made peace with being occasionally misunderstood. They've accepted that their path will not always be legible to the people around them, and they've stopped making that legibility a condition for moving forward. That peace is available to you. It doesn't require everyone to understand. It just requires you to trust yourself enough that their lack of understanding doesn't feel like an emergency. Walk your path. You don't need to narrate every step of it. Chapter 9. Build systems that work without you feeling like it. Here's a pattern that's probably familiar. You have a strong week, motivated, clear-headed, consistent. You exercise, you work on what matters, you sleep well, you feel like you're becoming who you want to be. And then life interferes. A stressful few days, a disruption, a stretch where the energy just isn't there. And the whole thing collapses, not gradually, almost overnight. And then you spend another 2 weeks trying to rebuild the momentum you lost. Sound familiar? The problem isn't your discipline, and it isn't your character. The problem is that your progress was built on motivation, which is by nature a fluctuating resource. Motivation is weather. Some days it's clear and energizing, some days it's gray and heavy, and some days there's a storm and nothing feels possible. If your consistency depends on the weather being good, your progress will always be seasonal. What the most consistent people have built instead are systems, private, personal, largely invisible structures that keep them moving regardless of what the motivational weather looks like on any given day. A system doesn't care how you feel, it just runs. Think of it this way: your physical health doesn't stay good because you feel inspired about it every day. It stays good because you've built habits so embedded in your routine that skipping them would feel stranger than doing them. The workout isn't a motivational event. It's a Tuesday. It's just what happens on Tuesdays. That's a system working. The most powerful private systems share a few common qualities. They're simple enough to execute even on your worst days. They're specific enough that there's no ambiguity about whether you've done them, and they're genuinely yours, designed around how you actually function, not around some idealized version of yourself you've seen in a productivity video. Let's talk about the architecture of this. Your morning is the most important system you'll ever build because it determines the psychological context for everything that follows. A morning that begins on your terms, where you set the first tone of the day rather than your notifications, creates a fundamentally different internal environment than one where you wake up and immediately hand your attention to everyone else's agenda. This doesn't have to be a 2-hour ritualistic production. It might be 20 minutes of movement, 5 minutes of journaling, and 10 minutes of actually thinking about what matters most today before you open anything external. What makes it powerful isn't the specific activities, it's the consistency and the sequence, the fact that your day starts with you, not with the world's demands. Your evening is equally important and more often neglected. An intentional evening routine serves two functions. First, it helps you close the day properly, reviewing what happened, acknowledging what went well, noting what you do differently, letting go of what doesn't need to travel with you into tomorrow. Second, it creates a transition that actually allows your nervous system to downshift, which means you sleep better, which means tomorrow starts with more capacity. Neither of these routines requires perfection. They require consistency. 80% consistency over a year dramatically outperforms 100% consistency for 2 weeks, followed by complete abandonment. Beyond daily routines, effective private systems include tracking mechanisms that give you feedback independent of external recognition. You need to be able to see your own progress, not because you need validation, but because progress that isn't visible tends to feel like no progress. This might be a simple habit tracker, a journal where you log what you did each day, a note in your phone that marks your streaks. The specifics matter far less than the fact that you can see what you're building even when no one else can. Systems also need decision frameworks, pre-established criteria for the common choices you face repeatedly. How do you decide whether to take on a new commitment? What's your filter for how to spend discretionary time? What's your rule for when to push through difficulty versus when to genuinely rest? Having thought these through in advance means you're not making them from scratch every time under pressure. You're executing a decision you already made with a clear head. Here's something essential that often gets skipped. Your systems need recovery built in, not as an afterthought, not as the thing you do when you've broken down, as a designed, non-negotiable component of the structure. Peak performance requires not just output systems, but restoration systems, the weekly review that gives you perspective, the rest day that's actually restful, the regular practice that fills you back up rather than drawing from your reserves. Without these, your systems will work brilliantly for a while and then burn you out. And your systems need to be designed for real life, not ideal conditions. What's the minimum version of your morning routine that still preserves the essential function for the days when you're traveling or sick or time compressed? If your system only works when everything is perfect, it's fragile. Build in the reduced version, the non-negotiable core, so that even on the hardest days, something runs. Finally, expect your systems to evolve. What works at one chapter of your life needs revisiting at the next. The routine that served you when you were single looks different when you have a family. The system that worked when you were building something from zero looks different when you're maintaining something established. Regular review, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, keeps your systems alive and relevant rather than letting them calcify into rigid routines you follow out of inertia rather than intention. The psychological gift of good private systems is something money can't buy and no one else can give you. The quiet confidence of knowing that your progress doesn't depend on how you feel. That even on the days when motivation is nowhere to be found, the structure holds. The machine runs. You show up, not because you feel like it, but because you've built something that makes showing up the path of least resistance. That's not discipline in the white-knuckled, grit-your-teeth sense. That's architecture. And architecture, once built, holds without you having to hold it. Build your systems. Then let them carry you on the days you can't carry yourself. Chapter 10. Master the Voice. Inside your head, right now, as you read this, there's a conversation happening inside you. It never really stops. From the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, there's a voice, commenting on what you're doing, predicting how things will go, interpreting what that look someone gave you actually meant, deciding whether you're on track or falling behind, whether you're enough or not quite. That voice is your internal dialogue. And here's the thing most people never fully reckon with. That voice is shaping your life more than almost any external circumstance ever could. Not because it's always right, but because you listen to it constantly and mostly without questioning it. The quality of your internal dialogue, the tone, the content, the default narratives it runs, directly determines how you show up under pressure, how quickly you recover from setbacks, how much energy you have available for the things that matter, and whether you move through life with a sense of quiet confidence or a persistent undertow of self-doubt. And here's the part that changes everything. That voice is not fixed. It is not your permanent, unalterable inner truth. It's a pattern, learned, reinforced, and therefore changeable. You built it over years, often without realizing you were building anything, and you can rebuild it deliberately, with intention and practice. Most people's internal dialogue is heavily shaped by voices they absorb from the outside. A critical parent whose standards were never quite met, a teacher who dismissed them at a crucial developmental moment, a peer group that made them feel perpetually on the outside of something, a culture that told them their worth was conditional on productivity, appearance, or achievement. These external voices got internalized over time. They moved inside and set up permanent residence. And now they feel like your voice, even when they're not. The first step in mastering your internal dialogue is the most uncomfortable one. You have to actually listen to it. Most people are running their inner commentary at full volume without ever consciously attending to what's being said. When you start to pay attention, really notice the words, the tone, the assumptions, you'll often be genuinely shocked, not at how negative it is necessarily, but at how automatic it is, how unexamined, how relentlessly it narrates every experience through a fixed filter that you never consciously chose. You might notice that your inner voice catastrophizes minor setbacks into evidence of permanent inadequacy, that it compares your internal experience to other people's external performance and always finds you lacking. that it focuses almost exclusively on what went wrong, what's missing, what you haven't done yet, while barely acknowledging what you've built, what you've survived, what you've figured out. Once you can hear it clearly, you have a choice you didn't have before. Because you can't change what you can't see, but once you can see it, you're no longer just a passenger in it. Here's the reframe that matters most. Your inner voice is not reporting facts. It's constructing interpretations. There is a massive difference between what happened and what your mind decided it means. The email that went unanswered is a fact. The story that it means you're being ignored, that the person has lost respect for you, that this is the beginning of a pattern of exclusion, that's a construction. And you built it in about 4 seconds without any real evidence, and then started feeling the emotions that the story generates. Learning to separate the fact from the interpretation, to ask yourself what actually happened here, separate from the story I'm telling about it, is one of the most powerful cognitive skills you can develop. It doesn't eliminate the stories, but it creates space between the event and the meaning, and in that space, you get to participate in what meaning gets made. The next layer is learning to actively challenge your unhelpful thoughts rather than accepting them as settled truth. When your inner voice announces, "I can't do this," that's not a conclusion. That's a hypothesis. And hypotheses can be tested. Ask yourself, what evidence actually supports this? Have I done difficult things before that I initially thought I couldn't do? What would I say to someone I care about if they said this about themselves? That last question is particularly powerful. Most people treat themselves with a level of harshness in their inner dialogue that they would never direct toward anyone they love. They'd be patient, encouraging, perspective-giving with a friend, but internally they're brutal. Developing the habit of speaking to yourself with the same basic decency you'd offer someone you genuinely care about is not soft or self-indulgent. It's functionally essential. A harsh internal environment produces anxiety, avoidance, and contraction. A supportive internal environment produces clarity, courage, and expansion. This doesn't mean becoming unrealistically positive. Toxic positivity, the relentless insistence that everything is fine and you feel amazing, is just another form of disconnection from reality. What you're building is something more nuanced and more durable, a voice that is honest about difficulty while remaining oriented toward possibility. That acknowledges mistakes while maintaining perspective about what they mean. That can say, "That didn't go the way I wanted," and also, "Here's what I can learn from it, and here's what I'm doing next." Your inner dialogue also shapes how you perform under pressure, which is when it matters most. In high-stakes moments, a difficult conversation, an important presentation, a decision with real consequences, your internal voice is running commentary in real time. If that commentary is panicked and scattered, you'll perform below your actual capability. If it's focused and directive, you'll often perform above what your circumstances seem to warrant. Athletes have known this for decades. The difference between the ones who deliver under pressure and the ones who don't is rarely physical. It's almost always the quality of what they're saying to themselves in the critical moments. You can develop this same skill, not by pretending you're not under pressure, but by having practiced enough internal conversations that you can talk yourself through rather than into a spiral. There's one more dimension here that doesn't get enough attention: celebrating privately. Most people's inner voice only speaks up to criticize and correct. It's silent when things go well and loud when they don't. A balanced internal dialogue actively acknowledges progress, recognizes effort, and marks milestones, not with grandiosity, but with genuine, quiet acknowledgement. That was hard and I did it. That matters. This internal recognition doesn't require anyone else. It doesn't need to be posted or shared or witnessed. It just needs to happen. Because the inner voice that notices your growth, that keeps a record of what you've overcome and what you've built, is the inner voice that keeps you going when the external environment offers nothing to sustain you. Master the voice inside your head, because every other external challenge you face with that voice as your only constant companion. Make sure it's on your side. Chapter 11. Confidence isn't loud, it's consistent. There's a version of confidence that most people recognize, the one that takes up space, speaks first, fills the room, performs certainty, even when it isn't fully there. That version gets a lot of attention, but it's often the most fragile kind, because it depends on conditions staying favorable, on audiences staying impressed, on the performance holding up. The confidence worth building is quieter than that. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to be seen. It's the kind that shows up the same way on a Tuesday morning when no one is watching as it does in a high-stakes moment when everyone is. It's built not from how people react to you, but from your accumulated evidence that you follow through on what you say you're going to do. This is the confidence that comes from daily self-reliance, from practicing in small and consistent ways the act of meeting your own commitments. Let's ground this in what it actually looks like. You tell yourself you're going to get up at a specific time, and you do, not because you felt like it, but because you said you would. That small kept promise becomes a data point. You committed to not checking your phone for the first 30 minutes of your morning. You honor that commitment for a week. Another data point. You said you'd finish something difficult before the end of the day, even when it would have been easy to push it to tomorrow. You finished it. Another data point. None of these moments feel dramatic in isolation, but they're accumulating into something profoundly important, a track record with yourself. And that track record is the actual foundation of genuine self-confidence. Not what you've achieved, not what others have said about you, what you've consistently done privately without anyone requiring you to. Here's why this matters so deeply. When your confidence comes from external feedback, it's only as stable as the feedback is consistent. Good day, good feedback, confidence up. Hard day, silence or criticism, confidence down. You're at the mercy of a variable you don't control. But when your confidence is built on your own consistent behavior, it has a completely different quality. It's retrospective evidence rather than current opinion. It says, I've shown up before. I've done hard things before. I've come through before. And that record doesn't change based on how today is going. This is what makes self-reliance in small daily actions so much more important than it might appear. Every time you handle something independently that you could have outsourced, a problem you figure out yourself instead of immediately asking for help, a discomfort you sit with instead of immediately escaping, a decision you make based on your own assessment rather than waiting for consensus. You're making a deposit into this internal account. Over time, that account becomes your most valuable asset, not because you're keeping score in some anxious transactional way, but because the lived experience of your own reliability becomes the bedrock beneath everything you attempt. When you know, not believe, not hope, but know from evidence that you follow through when it matters, everything feels more possible. Physical self-reliance plays a more significant role in this than most people realize. Learning to cook real food for yourself, managing your finances with genuine understanding, maintaining your living space with care, handling basic practical challenges without immediately calling for reinforcement. These aren't just logistical competencies. They're psychological ones. Each practical capability you develop is a small statement to yourself. I can take care of this. I can take care of me. And these statements compound. They create a general orientation toward challenges, a default assumption that you can probably figure it out, rather than the helplessness that develops in people who have systematically outsourced all of their practical life to others. Practical self-reliance and psychological self-reliance develop together. They reinforce each other. You can't fully build one while neglecting the other. Emotional self-reliance in daily life is equally concrete. Instead of reaching for your phone every time you feel bored, anxious, or uncomfortable, pause. Sit with whatever is there. Process it without immediately exporting it to someone else. This is not about isolation. It's about developing the capacity to be with your own experience without requiring someone else to manage it for you. When you practice this consistently, something shifts. You stop being at the mercy of your own emotional states, not because you've suppressed them, but because you've developed enough familiarity with them that they don't feel like emergencies. You've sat with discomfort enough times to know that it passes. You've processed difficult feelings enough times to trust your ability to get through them. That trust, earned through repeated experience, is what real emotional resilience is built from. Information gathering is another daily practice that quietly builds self-reliance. Before you ask someone else a question you could answer yourself with 20 minutes of focused research, do the research. Not because asking is wrong, but because the habit of finding things out for yourself builds a confidence in your own intellectual capability that has wide-ranging effects. You start to see yourself as someone who can figure things out, and that self-perception changes what you're willing to attempt. Decisions, the small, daily, inconsequential ones, are your daily training ground for judgment. What to eat, how to spend an hour, which of two options to take. Stop polling other people on these. Make the call. Own it. Notice how it turns out. You'll discover that you're right far more often than your habit of seeking external input suggested, and each correct call becomes more evidence for the prosecution. The case your internal voice is building that you're actually capable of directing your own life. Here's what all of this produces over time. A person who doesn't need to be loud about their confidence because the confidence is structural. It's built into the foundation. It doesn't perform. It simply is. And other people can sense it, even when they can't articulate what they're sensing. There's a quality in someone who has genuinely developed self-reliance that is different from someone who is performing self-assurance. The former is settled. The latter is effortful. Be settled. Build your confidence in the quiet, daily practice of showing up for yourself, keeping small promises, handling small challenges, making small decisions until the small becomes a mountain of evidence that you are exactly the kind of person who can handle whatever comes next. Chapter 12. Set standards that don't move. Here's the difference between goals and standards, and it matters more than most people realize. Goals are the destinations, the outcomes you're working toward, the milestones you want to reach. Standards are something different. Standards are the non-negotiable commitments about how you conduct yourself on the way there. Regardless of whether you're on a good day or a bad one, regardless of whether anyone is watching, regardless of whether maintaining them is convenient or costly. Goals get achieved and then reset. Standards are maintained for life. And here's the thing that separates people who build lasting lives from people who remain perpetually inconsistent. It's not the quality of their goals. It's the quality of their standards. Most people approach their lives as a series of goals, targets to hit, boxes to check, and goals aren't bad. But without standards underneath them, they're unstable. You hit the goal, and the behavior that produced it often dissolves. You miss the goal, and the entire effort unravels, because the framework was the outcome, not the behavior. Standards create a different architecture. They say, regardless of outcome, this is how I operate. This is what I bring. This is who I am in the process, not just in the result. Think about what that actually means in daily life. A standard like I complete what I start doesn't just apply on the days when you feel good about what you started. It applies on the days when the thing you started feels harder than you anticipated, when the motivation has evaporated, when finishing seems less appealing than stepping away. The standard doesn't care about those conditions. It just asks, did you complete it? A standard like I speak with respect, even when I'm frustrated, doesn't just apply in easy conversations. It applies specifically in the hard ones, or when you're tired, when you feel misunderstood, when someone is pushing every button you have. That's when the standard is tested, and that's when maintaining it means something. This is the crucial test of any standard. It's not whether you uphold it when it's comfortable. It's whether you uphold it when it costs you something. That cost, the times you chose your standard over the easier option, is exactly what makes the standard valuable. It's what builds the character that no external achievement can create. Setting genuine standards requires something most people skip: honest self-examination about what you actually value, not what sounds admirable when you say it, not what you think you should value based on who you want to be seen as, what you genuinely care about at a level deep enough to organize your behavior around it. This requires sitting with yourself, the quiet room we talked about, and asking the harder questions. What kind of person do I want to have been when I look back? What behaviors am I proud of regardless of outcome? What compromises have I made that I'm not at peace with? Those questions give you the raw material for real standards, standards that are yours, rooted in genuine values rather than adopted to impress or perform. Once you've identified your standards, specificity is everything. Vague standards are easy to rationalize around. I want to be a person of integrity is too abstract to guide behavior in real time. I don't say things I don't mean to make situations more comfortable. That's specific. You know exactly what it asks of you. You know immediately when you've met it and when you haven't. Process-oriented standards are more powerful than outcome-oriented ones, for the same reason that internal scorecards outperform external ones. I will give my full effort to this is a standard you can meet regardless of how things turn out. I will succeed at this is a goal. It depends on variables you don't fully control. Build your standards around what you can always control: your effort, your honesty, your consistency, your treatment of others, your response to difficulty. Here's the relationship between standards and self-respect that nobody talks about enough. Every time you uphold a standard under pressure, especially when no one would know if you didn't, you make a deposit into your internal account of self-respect. And every time you compromise a standard for convenience, comfort, or approval, especially the quiet compromises that happen when the stakes feel low, you make a withdrawal. Over time, the balance of that account is what you actually feel about yourself, not what you tell yourself you feel, what you actually feel underneath the narrative. People with genuinely high self-respect almost always have genuinely high standards, not because they're performing for an audience, but because they've learned that the quality of their inner life is directly connected to the quality of their behavior, and they've chosen to protect both. Standards also act as a natural filter for the relationships and opportunities that enter your life. When you're clear about how you operate and what you'll accept, you stop tolerating environments that require you to be smaller than you are. You stop staying in dynamics that consistently pressure you to compromise what you actually value. Not dramatically or dramatically, quietly, almost automatically, your standards begin to curate your world. And when you fall short of your own standards, because you will, everyone does, the question is not how to punish yourself for it. The question is how quickly you return. Falling short of a standard is not evidence that the standard was wrong or that you're incapable of meeting it. It's information. It shows you where the gap is, and closing that gap repeatedly is the actual work of building character. Your standards don't need to be perfect from the start. They need to be genuine, and they need to be moving in the right direction. Raise them gradually as you demonstrate to yourself that you can meet them. Let them evolve as you grow, but always make sure they're leading rather than following, that they're pulling you toward who you're becoming, rather than simply reflecting who you've already been. The person who has developed unshakable standards doesn't need someone to define success for them. They carry the definition with them. They don't need external motivation to maintain quality, because their standards provide motivation that doesn't depend on conditions. They don't need approval to feel good about their choices, because they earn their own approval by consistently living up to what they've decided they stand for. That's what unshakable standards give you. Not rigidity, not perfectionism, integrity. The lived alignment between what you value and how you actually behave. And integrity, quietly, consistently maintained over time, becomes the most solid foundation a life can be built on. Chapter 13. Turn the fire of criticism into rocket fuel. Here's a moment you know well. You put something out into the world, an idea, a decision, a piece of work, a direction you've chosen, and someone comes back at you with criticism. Maybe it's delivered thoughtfully, maybe it's blunt, maybe it's wrapped in concern, but lands like an attack. And in that moment, something happens inside you, a contraction, a flash of heat, a defensive wall going up, or sometimes a sudden collapse of confidence that surprises even you. How you respond in that moment, not outwardly but internally, determines whether criticism becomes a chisel that shapes you or a hammer that breaks you. Let's start with the honest reality. If you are pursuing anything meaningful, criticism is not an occasional inconvenience. It's a permanent feature of the landscape. The moment you step beyond the safe zone of doing what everyone expects, when you attempt something significant, when you go in a direction that others haven't gone or wouldn't choose, you will attract criticism, consistently and sometimes loudly. The people who build remarkable lives have not figured out how to avoid criticism. They've figured out how to use it. The first skill in this is learning to identify what kind of criticism you're actually receiving, because not all of it deserves the same response. Constructive criticism comes from a place of genuine understanding and investment. Someone who knows what you're trying to do, who has earned some credibility in the relevant area, and who is pointing at something specific that could actually be improved. This kind of feedback is gold. It's uncomfortable gold often, but gold nonetheless. Destructive criticism is a different animal entirely. It comes wrapped in certainty, but lacks the foundation to justify it. It attacks character rather than behavior. It's vague in its claims, but precise in its sting. And more often than not, it tells you more about the person delivering it than about the actual quality of what you've done. Someone who has never attempted what you're attempting telling you confidently that you're doing it wrong. That's not expertise. That's projection. Learning to tell these two apart quickly, to receive the first with genuine openness and the second without being destabilized, is one of the most important emotional skills you'll ever develop. Here's the internal practice that makes this possible. Before you respond to any criticism, create a small but crucial pause, not a performative pause, an actual one. Breathe. Let the initial emotional reaction settle enough that it's not running the show. Then ask yourself 2 questions. First, is there anything true here, regardless of how it was delivered? Second, does this person have the relevant experience and genuine intention to make their feedback worth weighing? The first question keeps you honest and open. The second keeps you from being derailed by noise. The ability to find the grain of truth in even poorly delivered criticism is a sophisticated skill. Someone might say something harsh, exaggerated, or unfair, and still have a kernel of valid observation buried in the delivery. The emotionally immature response is to reject the entire thing because of how it was packaged. The emotionally independent response is to separate the packaging from the content, discard what's unhelpful, and extract whatever actually serves your growth. That requires enough internal security that you can admit there might be something here worth looking at, without feeling like you're conceding defeat. One reframe that changes the entire relationship with criticism. It's evidence that you're doing something worth noticing. Think about it. Mediocre efforts rarely attract strong criticism. When you do something that stays well within the lane of expectation, something safe, conventional, already validated by consensus, people nod and move on. Strong reactions, including critical ones, are usually reserved for things that are genuinely different, that challenge existing norms, that push against what people are comfortable with. If you're receiving consistent criticism for your direction, it might not mean you're wrong. It might mean you're actually doing something significant enough to disturb the status quo. That reframe doesn't make the criticism easier to hear in the moment, but it reorients what it means. Instead of, "This criticism is evidence I should stop," You begin to read it as, this criticism is evidence that I'm moving. There's also the question of what to do with the emotional energy that criticism generates. Because, whether it's fair or not, criticism usually produces an emotional response: hurt, frustration, anger, doubt. These feelings are real, and they're valid. The question isn't whether to feel them. The question is what you do with them. The most powerful thing you can do is convert them. Let the frustration become focus. Let the hurt become hunger. Let the doubt become determination to prove, not to the critic, but to yourself, that you have what it takes to keep going. This isn't suppression, it's transformation. You're not pretending the feeling isn't there. You're directing its energy rather than being drained by it. There's a practical aspect to this, too. Keep moving. The worst thing you can do after receiving hard criticism is to stop and stew in it. Your forward motion is the antidote. Every hour you spend executing your plan rather than replaying the criticism is an hour that widens the gap between you and the moment that hurt you. Action is not denial. It's the most powerful form of recovery. And here's something worth sitting with. The critics who hit hardest are often the ones who are most invested in you staying where you are. A person who feels threatened by your growth will reliably produce criticism whenever you step forward, not because you've done something wrong, because your forward movement highlights something in them that they haven't dealt with. Their criticism is, in a strange way, confirmation that you're moving in a direction they can't follow. And that makes them uncomfortable enough to push back. You don't need to be unkind about this recognition, but you do need to be clear. Their discomfort is not your instruction manual. Learn to receive criticism with grace outwardly while evaluating it honestly inwardly. A simple, genuine, "Thank you, I'll think about that," closes most loops without either capitulating or escalating. It demonstrates maturity. It leaves space for genuine reflection. And it prevents you from getting drawn into defensive arguments that cost you energy and clarity. The relationship you're trying to build with criticism is this: it can inform you without defining you. It can point to areas for improvement without determining your worth. It can slow you down temporarily while you evaluate it, but it cannot stop you unless you let it. The people who have achieved the most significant things were almost always heavily criticized along the way, not despite their ambition, because of it. Their ability to keep moving in the face of that criticism, to extract what was useful and release what wasn't, to be shaped by feedback without being stopped by it. That was the edge, not talent, not luck. The relationship with criticism. Build that relationship deliberately, and let every critic, whether they meant to or not, contribute to the strength you're building. Chapter 14. Build a life that doesn't need rescuing. Let's talk about what it actually means to be free. Not the abstract philosophical version, the practical daily version, the kind where you wake up in the morning and your direction doesn't depend on who texted you back, where your motivation doesn't collapse when someone withdraws their support, where a single person leaving your life doesn't threaten the structural integrity of everything you've built. That kind of freedom, the kind that's real. Most people, without quite realizing it, have designed their lives around invisible dependencies. Their emotional stability depends on a specific person's consistent presence. Their motivation depends on external encouragement, staying reliably available. Their confidence depends on things going well enough that the people around them reflect approval back. And because all of these things fluctuate, because people are inconsistent, circumstances shift, and support networks have their own seasons, the life built on these dependencies is perpetually fragile. You know this feeling if you've ever had a period when the support dried up, when the mentor moved on, when the relationship ended, when the team dissolved, when the encouragement stopped coming, and you discovered that more of your forward momentum had been running on that external fuel than you'd realized. The tank emptied faster than you expected, and rebuilding took longer. Building a life that doesn't need rescuing is the structural answer to that fragility. It's not about becoming self-contained to the point of isolation. It's about ensuring that your foundations, your motivation, your emotional stability, your decision-making, your daily momentum, are built on resources that you own and control, so that external support becomes a genuine bonus rather than a necessary condition. This starts with the most fundamental layer, knowing clearly what you value and why, independent of what anyone else thinks you should value. This sounds obvious, but it's genuinely rare. Most people's sense of what matters has been significantly shaped by the expectations of family, culture, peer groups, and institutions. And they've never taken the time to step back and examine which parts of that actually resonate with who they are, and which parts they've simply absorbed without questioning. When your values are genuinely yours, examined, chosen, owned, they provide direction that doesn't depend on external consensus to hold. You can move toward what matters to you even when the people around you don't understand why it matters, even when the path doesn't look like anyone else's path, even when the external signals are mixed or absent. Financial foundation is a part of this that often gets separated from conversations about psychological independence, but it belongs squarely in the center. Financial pressure is one of the most reliable ways that external circumstances take control of your choices. When you're economically precarious, decisions that should be about values become decisions about survival. You stay in situations that don't align with who you're becoming because you can't afford the alternative. Building enough financial stability to make choices from your values rather than from fear. This is not a luxury aspect of independence. It's a structural requirement. This doesn't mean wealth as a destination. It means enough stability that your economic situation supports your choices rather than hijacking them. Living within your means, building reserves, developing skills that provide reliable value, avoiding the trap of lifestyle inflation that keeps you perpetually dependent on a specific income level to maintain a specific image. Emotional independence at the structural level means designing your daily life so that your well-being doesn't hinge on any single person's consistent availability. This isn't about reducing your investment in relationships. It's about ensuring that your ability to function doesn't have a single point of failure. The practices from the earlier chapters, the morning that belongs to you, the internal scorecard, the ability to self-soothe, the capacity to be alone without being destabilized, these aren't just individual skills. Taken together, they're the architecture of emotional resilience that holds when circumstances shift. Your daily systems, the routines, the habits, the decision frameworks, need to function without requiring anyone else's participation. Your exercise shouldn't depend on a workout partner being available. Your creative work shouldn't require someone else's enthusiasm to sustain. Your learning shouldn't need external accountability to happen. When another person is built into the mechanism of your daily functioning, their absence becomes a structural problem. When they're an addition to a mechanism that already runs, their absence is just a Tuesday. Here's something worth examining honestly. Where are the single points of failure in your current life? The one relationship whose loss would destabilize your emotional life most dramatically. The one income source whose disappearance would threaten your stability most acutely. The one person whose opinion you're most dependent on for direction. The one source of motivation that, if it dried up, would stop your momentum cold. This isn't an exercise in paranoia. It's an exercise in honest structural assessment. Because wherever you find a single point of failure, you've found a place to build redundancy, not to replace the thing you value, but to ensure that its absence doesn't become your collapse. Professionally, building independence means developing skills, capabilities, and relationships broad enough that your livelihood and sense of purpose don't depend entirely on any single organization, employer, or opportunity. This looks different for different people. For some, it's building expertise deep enough to be genuinely rare in a field. For others, it's diversifying income across multiple sources. For others, it's developing a reputation that travels with them rather than being attached to a specific institution. The specifics matter less than the principle. Your professional life should be portable enough that you're not trapped by any single option. And periodically, maybe quarterly, maybe every 6 months, do the actual test. Spend a week functioning as independently as possible across the key areas of your life. Handle problems without immediately seeking rescue. Make decisions without polling others. Spend time alone without filling it with consumption. Process your emotions without immediately exporting them. Notice where the seams show, where you discover dependencies you didn't know were structural. Then address them, not with self-criticism, with the same practical orientation you'd bring to finding a weak point in any system you want to make stronger. Here's what's on the other side of this work: a life that is genuinely, structurally free. Not free from difficulty. Difficulty is permanent and universal. But free from the particular vulnerability of a life whose stability depends on conditions and people you can't control. And from that freedom, something beautiful becomes possible. You can engage in relationships from genuine choice rather than need. You can offer support because you have it to give rather than desperately seeking it because you're depleted. You can pursue opportunities based on alignment with your values rather than desperation about your alternatives. You can be fully, generously present with the people in your life because you're not secretly depending on them to hold you together. That's not coldness, that's abundance. And abundance is the only foundation from which you can truly give. Chapter 15. Become the person others lean on. When everything shakes, we've come a long way together in this conversation, and I want to bring it home with something that might seem counterintuitive given everything we've discussed. The destination of winning alone is not aloneness. Let me say that again, because it matters. All of this work, the internal scorecard, the emotional independence, the private systems, the standards that don't move, the voice you've trained to support rather than undermine you. None of it is pointing toward isolation. None of it is pointing toward a life sealed off from genuine human connection. It's pointing toward something far more powerful than that. It's pointing toward becoming someone others turn to when everything shakes. Here's the quiet paradox at the heart of everything we've covered. The person who has done the deepest work on their own psychological independence, who has learned to carry themselves without needing others to carry them, that person doesn't become less connected. They become more valuable in connection. Because now when they show up for someone else, they're showing up from fullness rather than from their own unmet need. They're offering something real rather than performing availability while secretly hoping something comes back. You've been around people like this, maybe only briefly or in difficult moments, but you know the feeling, the specific quality of being in the presence of someone who is genuinely stable, not performing. Stability, not suppressing what they feel, actually structurally stable. They listen without their own anxiety running in the background. They offer perspective that's grounded in real experience rather than borrowed theory. They're present with your difficulty without being threatened by it or compulsively trying to fix it for their own comfort. Being that person doesn't happen by trying to be that person. It happens as the natural result of doing your own work consistently over time, without shortcuts. The foundation of it is what psychologists call a non-reactive presence. When the situation around you becomes emotionally charged, when someone is in crisis, when circumstances are uncertain, when the conversation is hard, you remain the temperature in the room rather than absorbing it. Not because you don't feel the weight of what's happening, but because you've developed enough internal stability that you can hold the weight without being crushed by it. This comes specifically from having learned to sit with your own difficult emotions rather than running from them. When you've processed your own grief, you can be present with someone else's without being overwhelmed. When you've made peace with your own uncertainty, you can sit with someone else's fear without needing to immediately resolve it. When you've done your own work on your own wounds, you can hear about someone else's without it triggering defensive reactions in you. You can't offer what you haven't developed, which is why everything in this conversation has been pointing here all along. The person who becomes a source of strength for others has also learned something crucial about what actually helping looks like. It doesn't look like solving everyone's problems. It doesn't look like making everyone comfortable. Real help, the kind that builds people up rather than making them dependent, often looks like asking the question that helps someone find their own answer, offering the perspective that helps someone see their own capability, being present in a way that reminds someone of their own strength rather than replacing it with yours. There's a profound difference between helping and enabling. Helping means you support someone in developing their own capacity. Enabling means you remove the difficulty that would have built that capacity, because watching them struggle is uncomfortable for you. The person who has done their own psychological work can tell these apart, and can offer the former even when the latter would be easier to give and more immediately appreciated. When people sense that you have this quality, that you're genuinely stable, that your presence adds rather than takes, that you can handle difficulty without drama, that your support comes without strings or need, they move toward you in times of crisis. Not because you've positioned yourself as an expert or authority, but because you've become a safe place to land, a stable point in unstable circumstances. And this creates something remarkable in your relationships, a dynamic of genuine reciprocity rather than mutual dependency, because you're not coming to people depleted and hoping they fill you up. The exchange is actually balanced. You bring, they bring. You give, they give. Not because anyone is keeping score, but because the structure of the exchange isn't driven by need on either side. Here's something honest worth naming. The journey to becoming someone others turn to for strength is not linear. There will be chapters where you're the one who needs support, genuinely, legitimately, without apology. The goal of psychological independence has never been to become someone who never needs anything from anyone. That's not strength. That's armor. And armor is heavy and lonely and ultimately brittle. The goal is to need from a position of clarity rather than desperation, to ask for help as a specific choice rather than a constant background condition, to receive support as something you've chosen to accept rather than something you're clinging to because you have no alternative. That distinction between chosen interdependence and compulsive dependence is everything. And when you ask for help from that grounded place, you receive it differently too. You can take what's useful without being overwhelmed by gratitude or entangled in obligation. You can be genuinely supported without losing your sense of your own capability. You remain the author of your life, even in the chapters where you need co-writing. Here's where everything lands. The psychology of winning alone was never really about being alone. It was about becoming someone who could stand alone, and choosing from that standing position how and with whom you show up. It was about building an inner life so solid, so self-generating, so genuinely your own, that external circumstances lose their power to define you. It was about moving from reactive to generative, from someone who absorbs the temperature of their environment to someone who sets it. Every chapter of this conversation has been about one thing: the long, quiet, deeply personal project of building yourself into someone you can rely on. Not someone who performs reliability for an audience, someone who is structurally, genuinely, unshakably reliable to themselves first, and from that foundation to the people around them. That work is not glamorous. Nobody claps for the Tuesday morning when you got up and did what you said you were going to do, even though you didn't feel like it. Nobody sees the moment you sat with a difficult emotion instead of running from it. Nobody witnesses the private victory of making a decision from your own values instead of from someone else's approval. Nobody knows about the internal scorecard you checked honestly at the end of a hard day. But you know, and over time, you become someone who knows deeply, quietly, unshakably, that you can handle what comes, that you carry enough inside to face what's outside, that your foundation is solid enough that life can shake what's on top without threatening what's beneath. And then, almost without trying, something shifts in how others experience you. They can sense the difference between someone who is performing solidity and someone who has actually built it. They recognize the quality of a person who doesn't need them and chooses them anyway, who doesn't depend on them and shows up for them anyway, who isn't looking to take and gives generously anyway. That recognition is not something you engineer. It's something you earn, slowly, through the accumulation of exactly the kind of private work we've been talking about throughout this entire conversation. The person who has mastered the psychology of winning alone doesn't remain alone. They become the kind of person that others quietly, instinctively, reliably move toward when the world gets hard. Not because they have all the answers, but because they've done enough of their own work to be genuinely present for someone else's questions. That is the destination, not isolation, not self-sufficiency as an end in itself, but the freedom, the stability, and the genuine strength that comes from having built yourself into someone who doesn't need to be rescued, and who therefore has something real to offer to everyone who does. Go build that person. You already know the way.